Okay, Doug, good to see you today. You published just yesterday an essay on internationalman.com. I encourage everyone to check it out. But the essay is what happens after the election. Everyone's worried about the election right now. It seems to me, and you make it pretty clear in this essay, that what happens after the election is some people should start thinking about that today. So everyone go check that out on internationalman.com. And in the meantime, Doug, just give us the overview. Like, what are your thoughts about what happens next?
Well, I guess as we've talked about before, the red people and the blue people in the U.S. have really seemed to hate each other. It's visceral. They can't have a polite conversation anymore. Can't even, I mean, entirely apart from the COVID hysteria, I don't think there's going to be a lot of Thanksgiving dinners this year because people are going to be so unhappy. So this is really, really quite serious what's going on. And let me make a parenthetical comment here. It's funny, they call the Democrat counties blue counties and the Republican counties red counties. And this is totally counterintuitive because the left has always been associated with the color red, and the right more or less associated with the color blue, at least by contraposition. So when did this happen that they were reversed, that you call the leftists blue type? And apparently, I looked into it, and apparently this started back in around the year 2000, where some reporter or some talking head or some anchor person made this distinction, and it was adopted and picked up, and nobody said anything. Wait a minute, how can you call the leftists blue? I guess it would have seemed too outrageous if you'd called a spade, in other words, and said the leftists are red, because that's where all the communists and the socialists and the welfare state people are. But they've done it, and like everything else, middle America and the so-called conservatives and the Republicans just accept what they're given. You know, I mean, you could call them whipped dogs, and they'd probably accept that too. But anyway, it's reversed.
But the question would be, well, what kind of dog? Because we like dogs. So if it's like it's a golden retriever, it's fine. They just would be concerned about whipped dog, probably.
Whipped dogs, yeah. Well, I don't know. Can you turn it's probably harder to turn a pit bull or a Rottweiler into a whipped dog than it is to turn a Cocker Spaniel into a whipped dog.
That's right. I think you're right. Yeah. So
I'm a poodle person myself, which sounds ridiculous, but I hasten to say that they're a standard, and king poodles, which were famous for hunting the deadly otter in medieval times. And otters, I've owned otters, incidentally. I've had a half a dozen otters as pets in my life, and they are deadly prey. So, but they got along well with my poodles at the time. So that's the background of poodles. And I don't know when else we'll talk about this. I've got to mention this. People wonder, well, how did poodles get those faggot hairdos? And the way it happened was this, is that in the process of hunting otters, poodles have wool, not hair like most dogs do. And people found that when they jumped into the water, their wool would get waterlogged and it slowed them down. So they gave them clips so that there were pom-poms around their joints to keep their joints warm. And that's how they got the frou-frou haircuts. Oh. And then later, when the nobility went back to the castle after a day of, hunting the deadly otter, they found that you could wipe your hands on your poodle, but you couldn't do that on your wolfhound, or you'd come up with a palm full of fur. But you wipe your greasy hands after you're eating haunches of beef on your poodle, and it's fine. It's like a napkin. So that's how they became dogs of royalty and so forth. But they're not looked upon that way today. So anyway, sorry to get off on that tangent, which
I love it.
Absolutely nothing to do with what we're going to talk about, though. So
we have red states and blue states. We don't get along. and we have a very divisive election coming. What happens? I guess what was the thesis essentially of what you're trying to say in that essay?
Well, I think the US is in process of having what has become known as a color revolution. Uh, Most recently in the Ukraine, uh, where all these countries in Eastern Europe and North Africa, where they had a regime change, internal regime change, they called it a revolution and they gave it a color.
Hmm.
And what they're trying to do now, and this is apparently the Soros people. I mean, I've never met Soros personally. Jim Rogers, who's a very old and dear friend of mine, used to be Soros's partner for years, and they made $1 billion together. And I asked Jimmy about this, and Jim said that he never ever talked with George about politics, and that's believable because Jim is an anarcho-capitalist like we are. And if he'd gotten into this seriously with Soros, then they wouldn't have been partners, and the quantum fund wouldn't have existed and so forth. So I've never met Soros personally, but apparently he's put many millions of dollars towards electing ultra leftist prosecutors and all kinds of people. And the objective, if this is true, I assume it's true, is to have a color revolution in the US, and they call it the purple revolution. I guess you've heard that term in terms of the US.
I have, but I don't really understand why the color purple.
Because you mix red and blue, and you get purple. So that's where it came from. And this sounds weird and crazy. I mean, the US, come on. But the other day, well, after the first Trump-Biden debate on CNN, 3 of the 4 males on that panel, or at least the panel I watched right after it was over, were wearing purple ties. And of course, ties are generally going out of fashion, but purple is not a usual color for a tie. It's usually red or blue or something else. But purple ties they're extraordinary. So 3 of the 4 guys were wearing those. I've seen Hillary wearing a purple dress a couple of times. So this is apparently to virtue signal and show that you're one of the in crowd. Anyway, take a look and see if this is selective perception on my part or not. But you never see a purple tie, and you don't see 3 of them on a panel at the same time. Anyway, there we have it. So that's why they call it a purple revolution, combining the red and the blue in this country. And I think they're serious, because if you listened, and we've covered this, I guess, in at least one past conversation we've had, but if you look at the 20 people that wanted to be the Democratic presidential nominee, these people were all ultra leftists. The only person that seemed like she was more or less normal was Tulsi Gabbard, but I understand she's got the same leftist economic views. She was just an outsider because she was anti-war. All the rest of them liked the idea of having soldiers in 100 different countries around the world. But all of them have these absolutely socialist, even communist economic views, like de Blasio and Harris. And really, these people are really reading things right out of Marx's Communist Manifesto, which is an interesting read. Short, everybody ought to read it. So that's the way things are heading. They really want to change the culture of the US, to overthrow what the US stands for. And I guess, this is the other interesting thing. I watched the debate last night between Harris and
Pence.
And I always thought that Pence was a real non-entity. But I got to say, I think being objective as I can about this, uh, Pence won the debate. And, Harris just came off as nasty and snarky and snide. That was my feeling. And I was kind of surprised to find that on CNN afterwards, they had a focus group with, I don't know, like 20 average Americans from across the country. And all but one of them uh, said the same thing about Harris. So it's proof that she's a very bad choice for.
She is. I mean, she didn't even she bowed out of the presidential race before the first primary because she was so unpopular with people. And but I almost think, and if you, and this idea of a color revolution happening, Doug, it doesn't really matter what the people think. That things that are in motion, essentially, the political trends that are in motion seem to discount essentially the average voter, or or the history of the country, or anything. Like, it doesn't matter if they pick the candidate who's the least popular among all the Democratic candidates.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, because in past revolutions that we know of, or frankly, almost every political revolution, it's a cadre, a term that the left likes to use. It's a relatively small cadre that pulls the thing off and influences the hoi polloi, the common people. The Romans called them the capita censi, the head count, because they don't think, they just feel, and just feed them an entertainment and entertain them, and you're fine. So could we actually have a subtle revolution here in the US, or maybe not so subtle? These things often get out of control. I mean, people forget that the Cuban Revolution, Castro landed on, I think his boat was called Granma in Santiago province in the far east of Cuba. And he only had 50, 60 guys. And that's all it took. And Russia, there weren't that many Bolsheviks, just a couple hundred Bolsheviks. And they took over a country of 100 million people at the time. So, a dedicated ideological cadre that has a good rap, that can promise all kinds of great pie in the sky to people, yeah, they'll go for it. And especially in a time of economic turmoil, which we are definitely going to have, you can forget about a V-shaped recovery. The people want change. They want the promise of something better. So yeah, these people, the leftists, could pull it off. They're really good at promising all kinds of great stuff. And of course, the average guy whose standard of living has been flat to even going down for since 1970, more or less. He sees that the rich have been getting not just richer, but a lot richer. The houses they live in, the jets they fly, the Lamborghinis they drive, et cetera, et cetera. And it stimulates envy. And of course, the left loves to stoke the fires of envy. So yeah, I think it's entirely possible we could have a purple revolution here in the US.
Well, what happens if, but you talked in the essay about, well, the situation if Trump is elected, and versus Biden, how does the scenario in your mind roll out, if depending upon the election results, or whether or not there's election results at all?
Right. Well, right. The problem with Trump, the problem with this whole election is they don't talk about actual philosophical issues. They don't talk about what's right and wrong, what's just and unjust. They don't talk about the actual nature of what's left of capitalism as a system and the welfare state. It's not actual socialism that they're proposing, because socialism means that the state owns the means of production. And I think we talked about this before. It's actually very strict fascism, where the means of production are privately owned, but strictly controlled by the state. capitalism's gone and socialism. It's the welfare state that we're talking about. But
So they're
I
not
don't know.
talking about philosophical things at all during
No. They don't talk about that at all. They just level accusations of past misdeeds at each other,
yeah.
and attack each other's characters. And of course, both of them are quite correct. I mean, yeah, they're both like, both parties are basically embodied criminal personalities. So yeah, they're quite correct about that. And yeah, they're both going to do incredibly stupid things. And it's so funny, this complete lack of principle. There's zero difference between the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans at this point, on monetary policy. They both want to print up $1 trillion or $2 trillion, and this is just the next round, because it won't be enough dollars. So they're identical as far as that's concerned. They're both in effect endorsing the mass creation of money and distributing it by helicopter, which used to be a joke when Bernanke
It was a literal joke.
It was a joke, but it's not a joke. It's actually what's happening. I mean, not using helicopters, but electronically, much more efficient that way. So look, it's going to be an economic disaster no matter who's in office. It'll be a milder economic disaster with Trump, because although in addition to these stupid monetary policies, creating all this money, both of them endorse that, so it's going to happen, as well as the Federal Reserve itself pumping for it. Powell recently said that in a speech. But it'll be a milder economic disaster with Trump, because at least as a businessman, he understands the immense damage that regulation does. And, he's tried with, for every new regulation, you got to get rid of 2 old ones, and trying to get rid of government employees, and he moved with the Department of the Interior or Agriculture. I don't know what he did to Colorado, out of Washington. I mean, if you're going to regulate agriculture, it makes sense to be where the agriculture is.
Yep.
Things like that. So he's done a lot of things like that, common sense things. So you've got to support Trump. But the main reason you have to support Trump, even though he's an idiot in so many ways, is he more? Well, it's because he's a cultural conservative, and we talked about this in a previous discussion, I think. And the problem with these leftists is they really want to have a cultural revolution in the US. They want to overturn the actual basis of American society. They want to overturn the idea of capitalism and free markets. And you can forget about free minds, which you can see with the cadres in the universities, where, speakers they don't like are rioted out and canceled on various social media and so forth. So, yeah, you have to support Trump if you are for personal freedom, although Trump really isn't. And the problem with Trump, what the leftists say, if Trump is elected this time, he'll stay in office, he'll become a dictator. Well, if he doesn't leave the office, and of course he said he'd have to look to see if he's going to leave the office. So look, anything can happen here in the next month. Anything can happen. I mean, you couldn't say that before any previous American election. You expected one would win, one would lose, and there'd be an orderly transition. Not this time. And if the left wins, it's going to be a cultural revolution, like what they had, hopefully not nearly as bad, in China in the late 60s. And a lot of people don't even know what happened, haven't even heard what happened in China then.
Can you summarize what the Cultural Revolution, what happened and what it was like?
Well, I wasn't there at the time. I was in college. And of course, back in the 60s, we started to experience a cultural revolution in the US and in Europe. There were lots and lots of riots and bombings, and the left was rampant with all kinds of collectivist and statist ideas. Okay, it all blew over. Started in like 68, and it was all gone by like 72. So it was 4 years of turmoil, but life went on. This time it's different. It's much, much stronger. The spirit of so-called cultural revolution. And what happened was that after Mao won the civil war against Chiang Kai-shek in 48, 49, he won it. And Chiang Kai-shek went off to Taiwan and took over that island. And the local Taiwanese, incidentally, were very unhappy about having these mainland Chinese taking over their island. That's a whole other story. Mm. But in any event, then Mao tried to reform the continent, the culture of China. And first he had the Great Leap Forward, where he was promoting all things like backyard steel mills, just absolutely inefficient. But that was his idea of getting China moving. It was an economic disaster where millions of people died. And okay, then that was like 55 and 56, I think. And then 10 years later, he came up with another brilliant idea, the Great Cultural Revolution, where China was going to get rid of the four olds. They were old culture, old habits, just the way things were done. And he did. He overturned the entire society where everybody had to wear a Bao suit, either blue or green or brown or gray. That was your wardrobe choice, pick a color, but they all looked the same. And it was group thought where, look, a couple of million people were killed, bodies floating down the Yangtze because they didn't believe or think or say what they were supposed to. A couple of million people dead, and the lives of tens of millions of people ruined. So
who were the targets of the Cultural Revolution? Because the little things I've read about it, I understand it was like all of the, like it was young people, the kids, students would basically go after their teachers, and anybody was a professor or educated professional, that they were targeted. Was that true, or were there other groups that were targeted?
Well, we didn't hear about these things so much back in the 60s, because just as in the days of Stalin in the 30s, the conventional press didn't like to report these things about Russia. The same was true in the 60s with the Cultural Revolution in China. But lots of books have come out since then, lots of articles and things by people that lived through it. So we do know what happened at this point, and it's really not denied. But could something that radical happen here in the US? Well, anything's possible. I mean, you look at the history of political revolutions and past cultural revolutions, who would have guessed they could have happened? Like after the Vietnamese War, partially because of American incursions into Cambodia, a guy named Pol Pot took over the country of Cambodia, a small country, 2, 3, 4 million people, not many people. 4 million, I think is the number. And since it's come out, well, it was showed in this movie, The Killing Fields. Pol Pot had a cultural revolution in Cambodia, and he killed, nobody knows, but about 30% of the country was killed. That's a lot of people. A third of the country murdered and left in the killing fields. Incredible. And even today, you go back to Cambodia, and there are scars from that because everybody had a relative. A lot of people alive participated in it. So cultural revolutions are the worst kind of revolution. You can have a religious war. And those are nasty, like in the Central African Republic, where I was headed to 5 years ago, but I couldn't get there because the airport was closed. It was full of thousands of refugees, hoping that the blue helmets would protect them from being hacked up with machetes. So that was a religious war of the Mohammedans against the Christians. And Bosnia, that was really a religious war. Once again, Mohammedans against Christians. So are we going to have a religious war in the US? No, I don't think so. People don't take religion seriously. It is a political war where the left wants to see taxes and a lot of wealth taken away from the guys. And make no mistake, a lot of the people that are rich today, ultra rich, are rich because of the same policies where all this money is flowed out of Washington from a fire hydrant, and it got to the rich first.
Yeah.
I mean, naturally.
Yep.
So sure, so of course these people, want to, it's time to eat the rich, actually.
But why are the rich, Doug? Why are the rich part of it? I mean, they're encouraging it. All of the elites are encouraging it. So I was watching, I don't know if this was the same focus group you watched after the vice presidential debate, but Frank Luntz, it was one that he was doing. And he had guest appearances from different people who came on and spoke. And the three people I saw that came on, not to speak, but really to ask questions of this focus group audience, they were very well-known people, famous people, rich people, they couldn't help themselves. But, in a focus group, you're supposed to collect information, not give information, but all three of them went on, got on their soapbox and talked about how it was critical for people to vote and how that we gotta, that we had to essentially, they wouldn't say we need to go vote for Biden, but it was clear that that's what they were all saying. And they're all rich. So how do these, if it's an eat the rich movement, how's it led by all these rich people?
I think it's because over the last couple of generations, everybody in the US has been indoctrinated in college. And all the professors, almost all the professors in college, are ultra lefty. So just because you're rich doesn't mean you can't have stupid economic ideas. Case in point, Warren Buffett, a stone cold genius when it comes to investing. But he believes in all these things, good buddies with Bill Gates and all the rest of this type of thing. So it's partially indoctrination. I think part of it is guilt. They may recognize that they got that wealthy because of acting as cronies, taking advantage of all the money that's been printed and favors that are dispensed by Washington in return for favors that they give to the politicians, like a lot of money for their campaigns. So it may be guilt. It may be because at this point, the spirit of the century is just in that direction. And, we're herd animals, let's admit it. I mean, we're social herd animals. And if you're the only guy that says this when everybody else says that, that's kind of dangerous. So maybe you better join the group.
Especially if you have reason to be disliked by the group already. You imagine the rich people who feel like they're, they can avoid the guillotine essentially if they're ahead of the crowd.
Yeah, exactly right. But the problem is that, as I said before, when we had a previous conversation on, I think we called it the six reasons why Biden is going to win, and I fear that's still going to be the case. That's what all the polls say. The polls were dead wrong last time, but this time I think they might be right. What happens with these cadres, these Marxist thinking cadres, is once they get in office, they want to cement themselves in office, and they'll do that in the United States. If Biden wins, Harris wins, in effect, because it'll be a Harris regency, because Biden is only half there at this point. What's going to happen? Well, they're going to make Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico states. Why? Because they're very leftist, the population. And if they become states, that's 4 more senators. So they'll control the Senate almost certainly. They will pack the Supreme Court.
Seems pretty obvious based upon their, and it
Pretty-
will answer the question. It's crazy.
Exactly. So anything that they don't like, the court is, their program, the court won't stand in their way. They'll control the electoral college because of the extra states. They may even abolish the electoral college. It's inconvenient from their point of view. They may reduce the voting age to 16. It's happened in Argentina. It's happening in other countries. Big mistake to get people politically involved at a time when their brains aren't fully formed. And I think I've said before, I think only people above age 25 should vote. And even then, there should be a property requirement. So it's not a question of 2 wolves and a sheep sitting down in a democracy deciding what to have for dinner. So, but I'm running against the spirit of the century here. I'm afraid to say that. So, and of course, there's 20 million aliens in the U.S. I suspect illegal aliens, and I expect a lot of them will vote anyway because anybody can vote. Quite frankly, you go up, present yourself, show a driver's license, and they'll let you vote. But they'll become official Americans, and they're generally, very welfare state leaning. So we might even have a constitutional convention, because when they control the apparatus of government, they might decide. I mean, the Constitution in the US is mainly a dead letter. Anyway, it's just kind of a talking point, but it's a dead letter for practical purposes. But they might decide to have a constitutional convention and say that it's time to change it. So all kinds of stuff could happen. And they're going to try to change the culture of the US.
One of the biggest things I think you said in the article that, again, I encourage everyone to go to internationalman.com to read, is it's not just the people know about, I think, packing the Supreme Court now, and people know about I think Puerto Rico and DC, but it's also the administrative state, the appointees. You talked about that a little bit, how Trump has handled that, and how it would be handled in a Biden-Harris administration, in your opinion.
Yeah, that's right. It's really amazing. The people that Trump picked, I don't know why he picked them, but there's been a lot of turbulence among the people he's appointed, where they turn on him and they hate him and they write books and they come out and talk about what a horrible person he is and so forth. Well, what kind of judgment does Trump have that he picked these horrible people that turned on him? I mean, that's the first question that I'd ask. But if the leftists win, it's not just going to be a random assortment of people that Trump rounded up. They'll have a ready-to-go set of thousands of ideologues to plug into political appointment positions. And, that's going to overwhelm the way the government is administered besides. So it's pretty hopeless. Usually in these elections, well, in the past, whether the Democrats won or the Republicans won, little changes here and there. But the United States is like a super tanker. It takes a long time to turn it just a little bit because it's got so much momentum.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got all these things we've talked about working in one direction, yeah, we could have a cultural revolution in the US. Mm. And I don't know how the right is going to react if this happens. Will they be violent? Well, they're cultural conservatives, so they tend not to be violent. They tend to accept the status quo. That's what a conservative is. They conserve whatever the standard, whatever they're given, they tend to it's bad news.
Hmm.
So, and if Trump wins, I'm sure we're going to see lots of riots and upsets and God knows what. Uh, Antifa and Black Lives Matter and other groups that'll be created. Who knows what they've got in store for us? So it's going to be a chaotic time. If Trump, more chaotic, probably in some ways, if Trump is elected. Still, I hope he's elected, just because I'd rather have 4 years of chaos where we can see where the old order is still kind of there, rather than immediately going into a Soviet-style America,
Hmm.
which I really think is the way it's headed if the left is elected.
Hmm. So, but if we have a purple color revolution happening now, then if Trump is elected, it seems like the playbook is that in these elections they basically undermine them. They present them as totally illegitimate. They get people in the streets essentially until there's an the leader, the elected leader, just quits. They just end up giving up and walking away. Or I guess in Belarus now, where they're that's super corrupt. It's hard to use that as an example, but where maybe the dictator, the elected leader, fights back. But for the most part, it's like they just keep. The playbook is just to totally discredit the elections and undermine the legitimacy. And in the minds of at least half the Americans, Trump's been an illegitimate president this whole time.
Well, that's right. And when you have a revolution or you're trying to take over a country, the first thing you want to capture is, in a backward country anyway, is the radio station and the TV station, so that you can easily put out memes. We're in control, and people tend to believe naturally what they're told by an authority source like the radio station, the TV station, the newspaper. So, but wait a minute, the left controls all the TV and almost all the newspapers and most of the radio, and they can deplatform you on the internet. So it's very demoralizing for the people who aren't hardcore leftists. I mean, the right is demoralized. I mean, I think they're desperate at this point because all around them, everything that they see and hear and what their kids bring back from college, I mean, they feel like they're salmon swimming upstream. And I'm afraid that we are.
Interesting. So what related to the, I guess, the media thing, you want to control the messaging essentially, especially in these really critical times. And it's, Facebook a couple of weeks ago announced specifically that they would censor any declaration of victory in the election until it was, certified by some official body of some kind. So they specifically, don't want somebody being able to say, don't want Trump, let's say, if he wins, to be able to claim victory, because like once that idea is planted in people's heads, it's hard to remove that idea. But if you can keep that idea from ever being planted, then the revolution can continue.
Well, and of course, Trump did say when he was asked, what if it is a challenged election, will you step down? And he said, well, we'll have to see about that.
Yeah,
So
that makes people crazy. I mean, the left, that drives them nuts. It almost seems like, I mean, I when I watched that whole interview, because I wanted to make sure, or that press conference, I want to make sure I wasn't hearing it wrong, that it wasn't selectively edited. He did say that. The impression I got was that he was like, well, I just want to see of course I want to see what the results are. I want to make sure it was done right first. I want to, adjudicate it at least to make sure it was honest. But, it's basically when people hear that on the left, they're immediately like, told you, he's Hitler. I told you.
yeah, I know. It's too bad that Trump is the best that the old regime has.
Yeah.
I mean, he is not John Galt. Let's put it that way.
No.
But he's a hell of a lot better than somebody like Bob Dole, who the Republicans ran against Clinton, and a lot better than that horrible person, Mitt Romney, And who else? I mean, the Republicans have always picked such horrible Me Too kind of people. At least Trump has an entertaining personality and some good ideas, albeit not too many, but he's a cultural conservative. And people can tell that the leftists really do want to change the culture of the US. So you can forget about, you know, the days of Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver from the 50s. That's gone anyway. It's like
Wow.
it's like trying to hold back the barbarian invasions during the Rome in the 4th century.
Mm.
You can try. It can be noble. It might be the right thing to. It is the right thing to do, but you're going to get washed away.
Mm. Mm.
I hate to be so pessimistic about it, but there's a bright side. There's always a bright side. And with all these insane things going on, and the US dollar is going to be destroyed as they print trillions and trillions more in a desperate, counterproductive effort to keep the artificial boom going. So gold at, what is it, 1950, whatever it is now, is going to go a lot higher, I'm afraid. And the next bubble is going to be in gold stocks.
Which
And
we're going
they
to talk about
are,
gold stocks on Monday.
so I won't go into that, but I think people should turn into that because in a time when wealth is being destroyed on a massive scale, you want to do something so that your wealth isn't destroyed. And since most of the real wealth in the world is going to still exist, and this too will pass 10 years from now. I mean, this will just be an unpleasant episode in history. So take advantage of it. Try to make as much money as you can. So yeah, we'll talk about that on Monday. That'll be a happy
There
subject.
is an upside. I mean, in periods of great turmoil and change, there definitely is opportunity. And it's certainly having capital, having skills, having good relationships, with people you can trust. Those things are useful in good times, and they're definitely going to be useful in chaotic times. So tune into the gold stock episode we'll do on Monday. And in the meantime, I definitely encourage everybody to go to internationalman.com, check out this essay. There's a lot more details in it. So go there and check it out.
And I guess related to that, we had a conversation about what was it titled? The Breakup of the U.S.
Yeah, most popular episode we've done so far.
And somewhat related to what we're talking about today, obviously.
Yeah, in fact, and you sent me an article yesterday from the USA Today that said I can't remember which percentage of Americans it was, but most Americans essentially expect or think that violence and civil war is possible at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's such an unpleasant thought. The only reason it won't happen is maybe there'll be a peaceful secession, which we talked about in that other thing. But maybe it won't be a violent civil war in the US simply because half of Americans are in their basement and half are doing drugs and the other half are too fat to get out in the street and fight. I know that that's three halves. But,
yeah, so definitely, I encourage people to check out the breakup of the United States episode we did, because there's a lot of good stuff there too. So, Doug, thanks so much. I know you're traveling over the next couple of days, but we'll be back on Monday.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Doug.